Hello, everyone. It's World Review with Ivo Dalder on Thursday, a day early, just because scheduling just makes that necessary. But it doesn't mean we're not going to have a really good and interesting conversation, which we will, with two people who bring great insights. Anna Sauerbrey is the foreign editor of Die Zeit, a weekly newspaper. For those who read German, it's a must read every Sunday. And Bobby Gosh, who has been reporting for Time, for Bloomberg, for many other papers, the Hindustan Times, of which he was an editor, and is now a geopolitical commentator and a frequent visitor on World Review with Ivo Dalder. We're going to talk about Africa and we're going to talk about Europe. And let me start with you, Bobby, because you have a piece in Foreign Policy about Mali, but I think we need to have a slightly larger conversation. All of a sudden, the world, not just because Donald Trump has decided he wants to focus on Africa, but the world is starting to focus again, on what's happening in Africa. Usually happens when there's bad news, and there is a lot of bad news. Darfur is back in the spotlight as a renewed area of genocide 20 years after the horrific genocide that took place there. We have fighting in Nigeria with Boko Haram, again targeting people, Muslims, Christians. We have the president talking about intervening. We have in Mali the possibility, as you write in Foreign Policy, of a regime, an Al Qaeda regime taking over that country. Um, Tell us a little bit about what's going on and why we should be paying attention, and indeed what possible solutions there might be in order to address this in the longer term.
Well, these chickens have been taking their time to come home to roost, and it's difficult to attach a single reason to all of those crises. But there are crises sort of breaking out all over sub-Saharan Africa. And from east to west, Sudan on one end and Mali at the other end. Many of these are a return of old crises now in more powerful and more frightening dimensions. But the consequences for all of Africa and for the larger world are no less dire for all of that. Just because we've faced these problems before doesn't mean that we know how to solve them. I mean, by definition, we didn't. And I worry that although the news has crept back into the front pages of some newspapers around the world, that still not enough attention is being given, and not enough attention is being given to the consequences. The Darfur story this past week, again after a long time, broke through into the front pages, into the top of the headlines, because, as you say, we're seeing a genocide again there. This time, a genocide being conducted by forces that are incredibly well armed and well financed. Some of that financing comes from Gulf Arab states, and that's very frightening. The underlying causes are very similar to the Darfur crisis of 2.5 decades ago. But we're not seeing the world engage with this one the way they did in the past. In part because there are many more crises. We don't see Hollywood stars and young people turn their attention to Darfur in the way they did in the past. In Mali, we have a very different situation, and that's there you can actually, and I try in my piece for Foreign Policy to draw a straight line from the crises backwards to where we began. And I think we began with France backing away from its responsibilities there. You have a Al Qaeda offshoot that is now on the outskirts of Bamako, the capital of Mali. If Bamako should fall, and let's hope it doesn't, then you have the real prospect of an Al Qaeda organization running a country. And we have not seen that. That's never actually happened. A whole country run by Al Qaeda. And if that were to be the case, then that becomes a training, potentially a training base, a base from which mischief can be exported all over Africa and all over the wider world. Um, what's happening in Nigeria is actually compared to these things, you don't want to dismiss a situation where communities are being targeted by a terrorist group, but in comparison to what's going on in Sudan and in Mali, on a much smaller scale. But there too, Boko Haram. That's a very familiar name. That's a problem that we didn't solve. That's a problem nobody has solved, and refuses to go away. The president of the United States is fixated on that third piece, and even more narrowly, the way he's communicating is that this is a problem for the Christians of Nigeria only, that the Christians are being singled out and being attacked, and therefore the United States should in some way respond. He's not being very clear about what that is. There's some vague threats about military action, which frankly are preposterous. But he's ignoring the fact that Boko Haram does not only target Christians, and in that, in fact, all Nigerians, Christians and Muslims, are menaced by this group. So a tour of the horizon there a little bit. There's a lot of crises breaking out across sub-Saharan Africa, and it has slowly begun to make its way into global consciousness, for which we should be glad. But that does not mean it's getting enough attention, and that does not mean we are anywhere closer to understanding what solutions might look like.
Yeah, or indeed, that's right. And may get attention, but maybe not the right answer to resolving it or to addressing it for sure. Anna, to what extent is this starting to break through this series of crises starting to break through in Europe? Much closer, of course, physically and geographically to what's happening. More immediate impact if there are large numbers of people moving out of conflict, and how's it kind of perceived from that perspective?
I think it is breaking through a little more, but only news-wise, not politics-wise. So the genocide, we may even have to call it genocide, in Darfur has been in the news and European newspapers and German newspapers on the television for the first time in months in recent weeks. So I think that, of course, helps to raise awareness in the political sphere as well. I think the threat from Islamist groups in the Sahel countries, in Nigeria, is much less perceived, at least in Germany so far. We have a reporter who's working on it, but it will take some time, and it's very hard to get people into those countries to report from on the ground. It's really difficult. So I think this is something we can only cover from afar. I think as far as political attention, as Bobby said, it's really hard to raise Europe's attention to anything else but the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the transatlantic security and trust crisis that we have and that we are focusing on. And I think that we have seen Europe's very limited political leverage in the Middle East already. And when it comes to African countries and the conflicts that Bobby has mentioned, it's even less so. Bobby has mentioned the European missions, the French, the German missions that have been on the ground, that have been retracted from there. And I think everybody here knows very well that it will be an overstretch to try to get involved in those crises as well. Though, of course, they do affect Europe first. Both the Islamist threat, the threat that may occur when groups, as Bobby said, have leverage through government even in those regions, and of course the control of migration, which was one of the first aims of those missions, and the deployment of troops in those countries in the first place, which is now not a possibility at all for Europeans right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's and troops may not be the answer in some ways for this policy. There's
maybe not European troops. I think European troops would not be welcome back there, especially given their track record. But there are other organizations, African organizations, as ECOWAS, as the African Union. There are other organizations that can be empowered, that can be supported, that ought to be supported, and to some degree pressurized to take action, because The Africans will suffer first, and they know this. They need help. They do not have the same sort of kind of equipment and resources as European and Western forces in general. They will need to be at the front lines, but they will need to be supported, and that needs to be done quickly, very quickly in Bamako.
And I guess part of the support is the lack of one, attention on the political level that I think both of you have pointed out, but the other one is the drastic reduction in foreign aid, which really does impact Africa more than other places. I'm always stunned when I read that for example in the last 2 years the largest humanitarian crisis in the world is not Gaza. It is Sudan. The number of people who have died from in most horrific circumstances, either from war or starvation or all the other ways, is far larger, both as a per capita, maybe not per capita actually, but certainly larger numbers in Sudan, and yet it takes a return to the images of 2004-5 of genocide to really get people to pay attention, and it does. I do wonder on to what extent Europe it thinks it is important to sort of plus up on the aid side, particularly because the United States is gone. USAID isn't there anymore. The U.S. military has just put together their plans in response to Trump's demand for a Nigerian interaction, and you can't actually do an Iraq or Afghanistan. Never mind that you shouldn't, but you need the kinds of people who no longer exist in the U.S. government. And so the question of is there aid, is there being given to this, aside from the military side, I think does arise for the Europeans.
I think the depressing answer is no. I mean, thought will be given to it, but not money. If we look at the German budget, 1 billion has been cut from the Department of Development's budget in this recent budget, and other European countries are cutting their budgets too. I'm thinking about the United Kingdom, for example, very important donor in the past, and now doesn't even have an own department anymore for aid and development. And there again, I think is that the crises are so many that it is in a way reasonable for policymakers to look at where the money is best spent in the interest of Europe's security. And of course, a lot of development aid under different budget titles, but in the end, it's German money is going to Ukraine or is going to the European Union to be forwarded to Ukraine. We will probably try to stabilize Syria with aid and rebuilding. The same will be true for Gaza. This will be EU money, probably, that will be flowing into it. But of course, Germany always has a large share in that. So I assume that there will be a large German commitment or European commitment in Gaza. And yes, when you have limited budget, then the question is how much can you spend on anything else? And since the U.S. share was so large, and it's not the only place where the U.S. is not spending their money anymore. I'm also thinking of the many United Nations sub-organizations that the U.S. are not funding any longer, where others will have to step up to. So it's really it's a crisis of where to spend the money, and I'm afraid that African countries are losing out.
Bobby, before we switch over, just back to you. I mean, in part, you make this case in your foreign policy piece, but more generally, this penny wise, pound foolish thinking is going to is going to hurt us down the road. In the European case, it's because of the geography being close. But how does this? If we don't address these issues, is it just? And I put that very much in quotation marks, a humanitarian crisis that's horrible for the people who are there, or is there a larger strategic consequence?
I think the answer is it's both those things. The immediate crisis will be humanitarian and local, but where we've seen what happens when extremist groups take charge of large swaths of territory. We saw that in Syria and Iraq when ISIS took charge there. If you go farther back, when the Taliban in its first iteration ran Afghanistan and allowed terrorist groups to operate freely from its turf, that brought us to 9/11. Here you have the worst possible of both those worlds, where you have the actual terrorist group running the country without the intermediary of a Taliban-like quasi-political, quasi-social organization. You have an actual terrorist group, which is, by the way, already heavily peopled by foreigners, people who are not from Mali, from other parts of the Islamist network, running a country. And Mali is not a small country. It's physically quite large, but it is also remote. There's plenty of places, figuratively speaking, to hide and to plan and plot. And if you have the resources of a government, even if it's a poor country, if you have the resources of a government backing you as a terrorist organization, then your ambitions can be international. And we've seen that is usually how it works out. So the opportunities for a Al-Qaeda like group or an offshoot to use Mali as a base from which to mount terrorist attacks across the wider world are there, and there's no getting away from it.
Wonderful discussion, even depressing, even though deeply depressing in terms of its outlook. Thanks for making us all smarter on this. Anna, let's switch over to what's happening in Europe. We've had a series of elections and a series of opinion polls. We had the Czech election where the far right did win, and then we have a new Czech government, again led by anti-EU and to some extent even anti-NATO people, certainly inside the government. In Holland, you had a new election where the center did seem to rise, which has given people hope. But you look at the UK, with the largest party now being Reform in the opinion polls. You look at France. Help us understand what is happening in the political sphere in Europe, with seemingly the far right either solidifying or retaining its large political advantage, and what impact that is having on the politics that is happening inside these countries, as they are trying to figure out both to deal with the real problems, but also to deal with the politics of being challenged on the far right.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think when you look at the past weeks, it's sort of hard to see the through line because you have those somewhat conflicting. There's somewhat conflicting evidence of, as you said, the rise of a left-leaning liberal party, D66, in the Netherlands, who's been part of many coalitions in the Netherlands before, but now came in first with Rob Jetten, a very young, progressive. I don't want to say Mamdani-like, but a young progressive figure with a lot of charisma, who won the elections and can now form a coalition, certainly without Wilders, far right VVD, PVD party in the government. And then you have, on the other hand, as you said, elections in the Czech Republic in early October, and just this Monday, Andrej Babiš, who has been prime minister before and has now been elected back into office, signing a coalition treaty that is very worrying, with two fairly radical parties, the Motorists and the Freedom and Direct Democracy Party, which are against the EU, against NATO, and also against addressing climate change, which they deny exists. So pretty harsh topics to tackle there. I think one through line is that we shouldn't be blinded by the success in the Netherlands. That I think the bigger story still is, as you said, the solidification of far-right parties in Europe. I think we should not be too panicked because many of the far-right parties we like to put in one big bucket are actually quite different. And yes, the election or re-election of Andrej Babiš is certainly one of the more concerning events in this line, because he's fairly far right, and as you said, his election might have serious implications for Europe's security architecture. But then there are other far right movements, of course, like Meloni in Italy, who've proved to be quite moderate once they're in government. And of course, everybody's now looking with great concern to France, because the Marine Le Pen movement is rising in the polls with all the political chaos there. Several governments toppled within just a few months. The president being at his weakest point ever, as is his political movement. And the question is, what would Marine Le Pen, for example, be in the government? Would she be more like a Meloni, or would she be one of the more radical types in Europe? I do think there is some hope in those elections in the Netherlands, that when you have the right candidate, you can make it through. We can talk about that more, maybe, like the progressive optimism that Rob Jetten had great success with, also because he addressed the right topics. He ran on a platform that, just like Mamdani in New York he ran on cost of living issues and bread and butter issues, and that in a can-do spirit. So that seems to be one recipe that is working. But at the same time, of course, we cannot look past the rising polls of all the others. And you've mentioned Reform, you've mentioned the AfD in my country, who's now polling at, sometimes even in front of the ruling Christian Democrats under Friedrich Merz.
Bobby, how do you see this? I think Anna sort of laid out the spectrum really, really well, and there is reason for optimism that the center can rise again. In Holland, of course, partly because the right had finally gotten into government and failed. And so it helps. It helps to have the right in government and see it fail, or the right in government is succeeding, which is clearly what's happening in Italy, where Meloni is one of the, I think, the second person is since the end of World War I to likely have a 5-year term, which hasn't happened in a long time. But so, how do you see this this larger picture, and should we be concerned? And is there any lesson for Europeans and maybe even for Americans?
I have more questions than answers. Honestly, I'm curious. I've been trying to drill down into the because it represents a moment of hope. I've been trying to drill it down into the Netherlands election. Unfortunately, the coverage of it here has been, perhaps not surprisingly, quite superficial. But Anna, perhaps you can enlighten on this. As you say, that there is a sort of Mamdani-esque quality to it, in that the progressives in the Netherlands ran on pocketbook issues, but what I'm not seeing enough in the coverage here is, what does that mean? What specifically was the kind of messaging around those pocketbook issues, and is it just completely sui generis to the Netherlands, or are there not just running on issues, but are there specific messaging pointers that others elsewhere in the on the continent, and hopefully progressives here in the US, can pick up on? And the flip side to that is, I'm curious to find out how much the European right has learned from Trump and Trumpism in the United States. And, in the Czech example, is there a Project 25? Is there now a plan of action from the right wing there that sort of sets out their stall and saying, these are the things we're going to do, and should we be alarmed about a more systematic assault on liberal institutions or institutions of the state that we are seeing here in this country?
I think those are two really good questions, Anna, and sort of I think the right has won because of the distrust in the government to be able to deliver, and therefore the answer is to make government work again for the average people. But at the same time, the right does have a plan, at least in the United States, as we're seeing. So how do you see both of those questions Bobby asked in terms of how to Jette do, and what does that mean for the other forces in the center left, center right, center of European politics? But also, is there an agenda that the right has that it's actually trying to implement and meet the people where they are, as politicians love to say?
Mm. Yeah, I think what's maybe comparable between the success of Yetin, if you want to call him, he's not a populist, but he picked up on populist messages, and what I mean by that is that he has the can-do spirit. His slogan was "Het kan wel," which is "Yes, we can," which is something Obama won on. And I think in the end, it's something that Trump won on too. He just convinced Americans that he was a change maker and that he could break with the slow progress incrementalism baked into the American system, that he could do away with that and tackle the very large problems that the people perceived. And Rob Jetten has ran on projects that, to someone who lives in Germany, where the government has promised to build, the past government had promised to build 400,000 units of housing, and hasn't even gotten, I think they got about half of that done. So that's really difficult to do. But he ran on a really ambitious vision of building like new cities with tens of thousands of units of new housing. And he somewhat convinced people that it was actually doable. And I think that being a politician who presents himself as someone who can actually do things is something that the progressives can learn from the far right, as well as they can learn from progressive figures who've run on such messages and succeeded with such messages. And maybe just briefly on the question of why did Wilders fail? I think I'm not really sure he failed. So the far right was split this time in the Netherlands. If you count those seats together, I think they even gained one seat in the parliament of the small splinter party and Wilders' party. And I think he still succeeded in the past decades, you must say, in really stamping the political agenda. So migration still is a very important topic. It's the topic this past coalition was broken over, and also Rutte's coalition fell apart over. So I think the influence he has on government, on the political agenda in the Netherlands, is still very large. And when you look at other countries, that's the success that far right and populist parties have everywhere in Europe, is that they set the agenda. That's true for my country. That's true for France. And I think Rob Jetten may be an exemption, but other parties still struggle to set their own topics and come in with positive topics and other topics than migration. There has been a study, which is very interesting, by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, out in September, I believe, which is the political foundation close to the Christian Democrats in Europe. And they have looked at the different recipes. I cannot... I think we're time limited, so I will just stick to the one basic message they have in there and refer to it for everybody to read. That including far right parties into government generally doesn't moderate them. I think then when you see Meloni, she's rather an exemption than the rule. So usually when people like Wilders join the government, they will form the agenda way beyond just a term. And they certainly do not moderate in each and every case. So I think that's still, that's one lesson we should take from these elections too.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think the way I would sum it up is that the far right is still determining the agenda, particularly in immigration. That's true in every country, including in the United States. And if you don't have an answer to that, that is sort of a number one question. If you can't answer how to deal with this issue, then you kind of lose credibility. But then the second piece is this piece of, but you have to deliver. And you have to be able to address the problems that the people see. And I think what the uniqueness of Trump is he did it on immigration, and then he ran on this policy of I can fix it. And Obama's Yes We Can was a little different, but Obama didn't deliver in the same way. Now, the way that Trump is delivering may not be the way that the centrist forces would like to deliver. So I think that this is the political dilemma. And the interesting thing is the U.S. political system, very different from the European political system, but it seems that the kinds of issues that everybody is dealing with are very similar. So we can learn from each other. And we certainly learned, Anna, from you, Anna Sauerbrei of Die Zeit. Bobby Gosch learned from you, formerly of Bloomberg and many other places. It's great to have both of you on. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review, back on Friday next time. Until then, I hope you all have a great week and a great weekend. And thanks again to both of you for joining us.
Thank you, Ivo. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye-bye.